Hey, thanks so much. It's really exciting to be here. Really nice group of people. Really enjoyed Nicholas's last presentation. However, where is he? Where is Nicholas? The end, where the artist gets paid, if you really want to give them the full experience, you know, you need to kind of like engage in like a back and forth of like 40 emails and then maybe like 2 lost wire transfers and then finally like send. Yeah, this would be really the full artist experience. You know, 6 months later, they get the kind of €5 or whatever. No, awesome, awesome work. Really happy to be sharing the stage with everybody here. I'm going to be talking on work that's maybe related in this kind of, what was it, failed inventor turned artist mode. I kind of describe it as this kind of overlapping space that happens between art and hacking. Lately, I've been thinking more about it as this relationship between misuse and empowerment and how this can turn into work that might look really different sometimes. Like I have a hard time describing what I do in kind of the elevator pitch. I have one strain of work that shows up in more classical white cube environments. I have a whole other strain of work that shows up outside, making tools specifically for the kind of activist graffiti street art communities. This is from a series called Propulsion Paintings. And then I have another body of work that is meant to be viewed natively within an internet browser. This is from a series called Tribute to Heather. But there's these 3 different places I make work, almost 3 different audiences I'm making work for. But the connection point for me is this either misuse or hacking, these kind of ideas that sort of connect them, hopefully will become more apparent after the next sort of half an hour here. I'm going to start back when I moved to New York to go to graduate school at Parsons. This was kind of, I was coming from architecture, similar to Aram, was realizing that after work I was having more fun than when I was in work. And so I went to graduate school to kind of learn more about code, basically. And living in New York, I was going to class and learning how to write code from people like Zachary Lieberman, and then walking from Brooklyn to Lower Manhattan every day, I was passing by all this graffiti, and these 2 kind of things merged in my head and turned into this kind of 2 to 3 year project for my thesis called Graffiti Analysis, which is where I'll start today. And I started from looking at how graffiti was written and how people who are outside the graffiti community might look at it, right? People like Edward Tufte, for any data viz nerds, everybody knows Tufte. How was Tufte looking at the written form? How were people who are just trying to describe calligraphy? How are they depicting motion of print in print? And I was taking these ideas and trying to write what I felt was like real software for a change. I was like learning how to write in C++, and I was feeling like a real programmer for the first time. And I was looking at graffiti not from a visual art standpoint, but from a performance art standpoint. And I was thinking, how can I make software that would just look at the motion, like forget about the ink, forget about the paint, and just deal with movement? And so what you see on the left is graffiti writers I would meet with in my studio or as I traveled, and I'd capture their tags using this system, which was hopefully invisible to them, and visualize it using depth kind of as a 3rd dimension, sort of like they're writing on a piece of paper that's constantly being pulled away, so you can kind of see how the ink overlaps on itself. And so these were my first kind of experiments with visualizing motion. The results of those, for a while I was then projecting outside. This is back in kind of early, mid-2000s. And the idea being that you never get to really see graffiti unless you're hanging out with graffiti writers or you write graffiti, right? You see the tag on the door the next morning, but you don't get to actually witness this dance, which, after having been seeing graffiti writers write, was really beautiful. You see someone's hand move in this way that they've done 1,000 or 10,000 times, and it's this really kind of confident, beautiful stroke. And this was about putting that motion kind of back into the city, allowing people to witness the movement behind graffiti and more than just how it shows up in ink and paint. And then that project, somewhere along the line, I was talking with a lot of graffiti writers, and it became apparent that my data was kind of flawed, right? Because I was making work about this data that happened in the city, but I was capturing that data in this controlled room. And so I started working with graffiti writers and trying to do this outside. And so the first step was just turning the laptop around. And so I would go out with graffiti writers. I would kind of make this human tripod where I'd stand there with my laptop. You can see me kind of here. And I would just use the webcam to capture tags from like a night of actual graffiti, right? Like real graffiti happens illegally, right? It's not the kind of pretty, beautiful colors that show up in a lot of magazines. Like graffiti is not graffiti without the act of it being illegal. And so trying to capture these tags really quickly using the system and then having some sort of way of playing that back later, and the data being something that was really tied to a door in a city and the ink actually being on the wall. And so I was documenting that, but I was also then trying to figure out on the representation side, what are ways that I can show that data in different ways. And so the sort of next step was making a second piece of software that would take the data that the capture application was exporting and creating these shapes that function similarly as the screen-based, right? It's still extrusion over time in this third dimension, but then exporting to an STL file, which then I can 3D print into these shapes, which I think of as kind of like freezing time. It's like, this is a 7-second tag from this graffiti writer in Vienna, or here's another 6 seconds from this graffiti writer named Katsu in New York. And so you kind of have this extruded form that then casts a shadow of the two-dimensional tag, but exists in this way where you can circumnavigate the tag, see how the ink is layering up. The thickness in the sculpture is based on speed, so you can see where the pen is slowing down based on when it gets wider or thinner. And then this is starting to play with time again. Like, I'm showing in galleries more and more, which I have one side of my brain that's like really critical of, but another side of my brain that finds it kind of interesting as I'm thinking about time in a different way than when I'm just making work and posting it to the web, and thinking about how these pieces are going to survive over a longer time period. And so this is a sculpture from the same data in a recent exhibition in Paris, and it's in this medium of bronze, right, which is something that, of course, artists have been using for a long time. But to me, this is adding back, it's like this gift back to Katsu, where this will be the longest running Katsu tag, right? Like this tag of his will be the last one, like after he's died and all the paint has been buffed off the wall. This one's somewhere either in some landfill or some rich person's apartment, or hopefully in some really nice museum. It'll be like coming out of the rubble, and this tag will be existing on this like longer time scale. But it's time that I think is what's so interesting about graffiti, and trying to figure out this way of thinking about graffiti as a time-based medium rather than a kind of visual art medium. And from going through this process also, and from other pieces I'm going to talk about, I slowly have been like figuring out that I'm more in love with kind of the hack behind graffiti than I am with the ink, right? And even with this piece, I realized that this is sort of becoming this cultural hack in a way. I'm getting people to look at these tags that happen on the street every day, putting it in this other context, and all of a sudden people who would try to legislate against this would all of a sudden be like curating it into these exhibitions. And this dynamic was sort of interesting to me, that they can look at this form that they've walked by 1,000 times, but just by showing it in this other way, they're able to sort of come at it in a different angle. And so this was like a thesis project. This was something that was working on over the course of a couple of years. And while I was doing that, I was doing what I think of as these weekend projects, right? Like as an escape from what became kind of a lot of poorly written code that would take me a long time to sift through and figure out what I was doing wrong. I was making these smaller projects. And so I'm going to show one of those weekend projects, not because it's my best work, but because it's something I try to get myself back to when I'm working on something for more than a weekend. So this is a piece, again, made back kind of in the 2000s, or earlier 2000s, called, I've got audio here. Okay, so these are post labels from the US, right, where you go into the post office, you get for free these mailing labels that you put on your package, and I was doing really basic font matching and printing just this very small addition to the postal label that says, in red in the upper right here, it says, "The US Postal Service does not acknowledge the authority of the Bush administration." So it's just this very, very small addition to this very ubiquitous free piece of postage you can get at any post office around the US. And so what hackers look for is places they can exploit, right? And so the exploitation here is that in the post office, this is an open system where you're meant to take, right? It's meant to be a kind of one-way data transfer. But because it's unguarded, you can actually slip information back into that system, right? Like this is the exploit right here, where you can take theirs and reinsert your own. And so other people, probably without their own knowledge, were then mailing around this message that I was hoping would seem as if it was coming from the government. And so this very small, very, very small interaction, right? This piece was doing the same time as Graffiti Analysis, and this ended up in a kind of like pre-YouTube era, like being a video that for me was the first time work had really kind of gone viral, right? And kind of bounce around the web. And so I was seeing how this piece that I kind of conceived, created, and documented and uploaded to the internet all in the course of between Friday and Sunday was getting was kind of influencing in a culture in a way that my two-year-long thesis project was not. And so this is what I try to keep getting back to in my work. I'll touch on that more in a bit. And the other thing with that piece was it was, for me, a kind of a new form of activism, because I was also going to marches, right, and participating in kind of like direct action campaigns. And this, for me, was really different, where I noticed that people were watching this video on the internet not because they maybe cared about Bush, but just because they thought it was kind of a clever, funny exploit. And so this, for me, was this, and seeing work like the Yes Men and other people who do this much better than I do, of thinking of activism as something more than just making signs and marching in the street, and thinking of activism kind of like even Franco talk about as this radical entertainment, like that we can make content that people want to come to because they want to watch it and be entertained, and then you kind of slip the politics in. So with that in mind, after those pieces, I ended up leaving graduate school, not wanting to go get a job. I got an art fellowship at a place called I-Beam in New York. And along with a person I met at the fellowship, became a friend and collaborator named James Powderly, we created this group called Graffiti Research Lab. Through Graffiti Research Lab, we were experimenting with a lot of these ideas I've already talked about, but also through meeting graffiti writers and meeting people more in this kind of hacking community, I started to realize that these were the same people. Like, the jokes they would tell over alcohol were exactly the same. Like, the kind of devious ideas they had were really, really similar. And so Graffiti Research Lab was kind of, among other things, about getting these two people in the same room and talking and collaborating together. One of the first kind of bigger hits we had was this project called LED Throwies, which is the easiest electronics project you can do. You just take an LED, a magnet, and a rare earth magnet and a battery, you wrap them in tape. You do this a lot, and then you throw them at things. And that was kind of the whole piece. And if you do that with enough people, you can kind of, the idea was like, how do we give back the pixel to graffiti writers, right? Like, advertisers have owned the pixel for so long, right? You go into Times Square, it's been a mess for years, you know? But as people who actually live in cities versus people who advertise in cities, we don't really get a chance to speak in pixels at night. So the idea was like, what's the kind of brute force, cheapest way that we can make a pixel and then give that away to like activists, graffiti artists, street artists, to be able to say their messages rather than the message of advertisers. And so we were doing kind of these actions for a while just as a way of like showing how the system worked. We were publishing an invitation for anybody to do this online, very overly explicit instructions for how to create this very, very simple circuit. But more importantly, it was an invitation. I think a lot of times invitation is more important than source code. Like that, the act of just saying, hey, this is out here, you can do this too, take it and run with it. And people ran with it, and people used it for many, many different things, from like marriage proposals to activist actions in Beijing during the Olympics. And so for example, this use was they were using LED throwers to make a banner drop, right? And a banner drop is something activists have been doing for a long time. They've been doing it for long enough that the media maybe doesn't care to even report. Like, it's not enough just to drop a banner anymore, right? And so for me, this is like the perfect use of this project, right? They had this message they want to spread. This image ended up showing up on the front page of the New York Times. And I think that part of the reason it showed up is because they have these blue glowing lights, right? Had this been written in paint, I don't think this would be quite of the mediagenic action, right? And activists are kind of realizing this, and a big kind of mental leap for me and the work that James and I were doing with Graffiti Research Lab was that this hack was the real hack. Like, the technological hack is really not that interesting. But the hack was a media hack. The hack was like, okay, if we give graffiti writers LEDs, if we give activists lasers, the media doesn't care what they're saying, but they're going to report on it because this is the story they want to write. Graffiti writers have lasers, right? And so we made projects where we would give graffiti writers lasers. This was a piece called Laser Tag. A very, very simple computer vision project we did in collaboration with Theo Watson, who's kind of a GRL member also. And it's a very basic motion capture system. It's really easy to motion capture against buildings because there's nothing moving, right? So you have a piece of software that says, where's the green dot? Put some light behind it, and you have a kind of system where we could come to places without permission and set up. And because this was early enough where advertisers hadn't really started doing all that much yet, laws in cities hadn't been really written for this, so we were in this kind of gray area where police didn't know kind of how to treat it. And so this was the first time we did it. It was in Rotterdam. The police actually came that night and didn't know what to do, and we invited them to write their name, and the policeman wrote Martin Rocks, and then they drove away. And so it was kind of, this became part of the hack as well, is that it wasn't clear whether this was illegal or not. And from a graffiti standpoint, we realized that it was kind of lame in a way because it was not permanent, and we understood this. And if we knew how to write on buildings safely with lasers that were permanent, we would have done it. Like James and I are very, our attitude towards vandalism is perhaps very much towards one side. However, the fact that it wasn't permanent allowed more things to go up. And the graffiti writers were kind of confused too, because as much as they want things to be permanent, they also really like seeing their name like 20 stories tall. And so more so than anything, it became this kind of free speech mechanism. Like we would only set this up if someone invited us to do it, which always was less interesting than if we went and did it on our own. The only rule was that it couldn't be censored. Like they could say whatever they want. And so it became this way where like citizens of a city could say what they wanted to on the scale of a billboard. So this work that James and I were doing with Graffiti Research Lab, which has since kind of come to a close, we've opened up the project and said anyone can open their own Graffiti Research Lab. So there are active branches. Right now there's an active German branch, there's a very active French branch. But my kind of interest in GRL, and James's as well, has kind of been more focused into the FAT Lab, which Aram touched on a bit earlier. I think everyone saw the kind of Google car project that Aram showed. This was this collaborative FAT project, which I think kind of really shows what FAT is about, even though usually we don't meet up in public space. We're actually much more of a virtual organization. The kind of fun captured in that, again, this idea of radical entertainment, we were taking things that James and I were experimenting with Graffiti Research Lab and trying to remove the stipulation that everything be about graffiti, but still use this idea of like furthering these open source ideals through public space by making content that people wanted to click on. And so this is a group of like people, most of us have, there's no real rule set to the group. We just kind of like formed, and then slowly the group kind of managed to evolve in ways that are kind of unclear. We mostly collaborate through a very old technology, through an email list. This is like our primary means of communication. We don't seek out money. This is meant to be our fun space, and money tends to like muddle things. So we don't actively seek out money. There's no form of like rules within the group, which can be a good thing and which can be a bad thing, but this is supposed to be our escape from meetings. We try not to make more meetings. There's no hierarchy within the group. It's not a democracy. Everybody has all the passwords to everything, in theory. What ends up happening is people forget them, but if anybody wants them, they have them. And so it's also meant to be this kind of experimentation and kind of like a collaborative anarchy amongst friends. And so we don't really have a kind of like formal written statement of what we try to do, but this diagram kind of sums up in a way, I think, what we maybe do best, which isn't sort of, we're not the best programmers necessarily, and we try to promote the kind of free culture movement, but we do that more by seeding it within popular culture. Like I think of us kind of as a guerrilla marketing wing of the open source movement. And so we have this kind of like, hopefully some nugget of chocolate at the center, but then it's like coated in candy, which makes it go down easier. So Aram showed the Google car one, which is the one I usually show, which frees me up to show some other FAT Lab projects. So Aram mentioned we have a show, kind of a group solo show up in Eindhoven at MU right now. And I'm going to show my favorite piece in that exhibition, which is actually a much smaller piece. This is by Geraldine Juarez. And it's an installation of these photographs, and it just says, 10 guys I would never fuck, right? And this is a sort of physical implementation of this Tumblr blog she created, which is just guysIwouldneverfuck.tumblr.com, and it's a series of guys wearing Google Glass, right? And so it's this really simple project, maybe deceivingly simple, because I think this is actually a really beautiful piece. I think this could be maybe more scary to Google than the Google car, right? Because how much money does Google spend trying to make people think they're cool and not evil, right? A whole lot. And if we could convince people that they will not have sex with you if you're wearing Google Glass, this is a very strong demarketing campaign, right? And so I think what Jerry's trying to bring up is that like how many times would the sentence like, take off those Google glasses and like, let's fuck, you know? Like, no one's ever gonna say that, right? That sentence will never be said outside of sarcasm. And so this is what like Jerry's trying to bring up is like, okay, you know? So this is like my favorite piece from the MU show, Geraldine Juarez. One of the pieces I showed in this exhibition, which is still up, it's called Ideas Worth Spreading, and it's a gallery installation that looks just like this. And if there's a microphone exactly just like this one sitting on top of the D here, and so you can put on this microphone and you can stand on the red carpet. And if you have a friend take a photo of you, it looks strikingly similar to a specific conference. The idea being that this is like the gallery as a way, as a kind of a tool almost towards the internet, right? And so you can come into this gallery experience, you can take a photo op. There's also a VGA, there's a table much like this with a VGA cable, so you can bring in your own laptop, and you can film yourself in this kind of studio environment giving a fake TED Talk. And there's a USB stick there. You can download all of the sort of TED intro sequence, TED outro sequence. There's B-roll of people giving standing ovations, so you can get a standing ovation after everything that you say. And so it's meant to be this like pirate TED studio where you can kind of really have ideas worth spreading, right? Like a TED without the curation, right? Like the idea that there's all these stories out that maybe don't fit within this kind of 12 to 13 minute format with kind of like poppy punchlines and dramatic pauses. And so with this installation, you can do that. And so what ended up, the gallery installation was kind of meant to be this kind of empowering experience where you can stand next to the sign and receive the power that it emits, feel it coming through the floor. But when you post those photos on the internet, this other thing started happening, which is it started kind of infecting Google's search, right? So right now, if you do a Google image search for TED Talk, it's actually much better than this. So this is a fake one from our installation. I think this is the 4th image now. And if you sort of dig through all the images that come up for TED Talk, a lot of these photos from the gallery start coming up, right? And so it's a way of using the gallery to put yourself on the same page as Bill Gates, right? So that if we start kind of like having less respect for trademark law and copyright law, it's a bit of a loophole again, right? Like the TED sign is very, very easy to duplicate. It's a Helvetica red, Helvetica bold red Pantone, very simple. You can recreate it for very, very cheap, and you can deliver your own TED Talks. And so that piece for me is kind of an example of how I think of as my primary audience, right? I exist professionally as an artist, and so I'm interested in more professional artistic spaces, but I'm also very interested in what Jonah Peretti calls the Bored at Work network, and how this mass of people, of which I used to be a member at one point, trapped in cubicles, bored out of their minds, using the browser as this amazing window to another world outside of the cubicle. It's a very interesting audience of people that have kind of rapt attention, and perhaps is like a place that's equally as interesting to hit people with new ideas, alternative ideas, as more traditional art venues. And so I think when I make pieces, the ones that feel successful to me are the ones that have reactions from both these groups, right? And they may be reacting in different ways. They may fail sometimes. But when there's one group that can see this piece in a gallery and another group that can see this online, so you have a piece in the MoMA and you have a piece on YouTube with hundreds and hundreds of nasty comments. To me, this is like success. This is exactly what I'm trying to do with my work. And a lot of the work that inspires me is work that happens in this similar, very, very small sliver where the art world overlaps with the real world, right? It's almost non-existent, but it is there. Like, it can happen. People will tell you it's not possible, but there's people there, and some of them are in this room, and they're making really, really interesting work. And so this is why I kind of feel like I have these two hats, like this artist hat and this hacker hat. And another piece of the hacking culture that I think plays into this more than just this idea of this kind of like technical ingenuity, I think, is this idea of fun. Like, what motivates people in the open source community, what motivates people in the hacking community is something different than money. And I think this is why some of this work is so interesting. And so this is Linus Torvalds, who is credited with founding Linux, along with many, many other people. And the title of his autobiography is Doing It for Fun. And he talks about how he created this system which is running on the majority of the servers that power the internet, which is a big deal. And it was created and functions better than systems that were created in a proprietary model. And to me, I don't think the whole world needs to run this way, but this is a really inspiring example that there is another model out there, right? There is something besides money that can drive a lot of these projects. And so this idea of play is something that comes across in a lot of these projects that I think, like from Nicholas and from Aram and a lot of other people. You see this idea of fun, and it kind of comes through in a way that feels very sincere. This is from an artist named Helmut Smits. Again, it's kind of, to me, this is like hacking an art like defined. It's simple, it's clever, it's playful, and it's kind of rather beautiful. And so this idea of play is something I also try to bring into my work. I have a series called Multi-Touch Paintings that maybe more directly sometimes involve this idea of play. This is a painting called Angry Birds Level 1-1. If If it's unclear, this is, if anyone else has like an Angry Birds addiction, or did at one point, this was created by just putting a piece of tracing paper over your smartphone and playing Angry Birds by inking your finger and then playing through the tracing paper. Like it still picks up, you can still play the game, you can still see it, but then you get these marks left behind. So this is how to win level 1-1. This is a piece called Slide to Unlock. I have other ones. This is username and password. This is me entering in my username and password to an active account. A piece from a more recent show, this is called Zoom In, Zoom Out. And so the series is meant to kind of have this kind of like, has a couple of things going on. One of them is this mix between something very personal, right, like the fingerprint and how we're learning to touch pixels for the first time, and it's actually quite awkward, right? We're all going through this for the first time. It's a little bit strange. And on the other hand, it's very, very generic, right? Like everyone's doing all these interactions that kind of Apple and other UI agencies are training us to do, right? And so we're the kind of first humans ever who do this like all the time, right? Like this is a new human movement that there was no reason to do, and we're doing that now. And so this series is kind of meant to be archiving these very awkward gestures and visualizing them in a way that's perhaps a little bit different. And so it happens that way individually, and then when you start looking at them as a bigger data set, they tell a kind of different story, right? So this is from a series where I sat down and I played Angry Birds from start to finish. And it turned into this installation. This is from the last show I did in Paris. It's 1,500 sheets of paper. So this is every failed level, every completed level. This is what winning Angry Birds looks like, right? And I say winning in quotes, right? Because this piece for me is, I don't know if I've ever gotten this reaction, but my dream reaction from this piece is that someone walks into the gallery and they see this and they kind of piece together what's going on, and their initial reaction is like funny, right? Like they get the connection. Maybe they've played the game and they're like, oh, cool, that's Angry Birds, I get it, that's so clever, ha ha. And then slowly they start seeing like what all that time turns into, you know? Like it doesn't go nowhere. Like this idea of casual computing to me is really fascinating. That's something new, right? That we sit there on the subway, in the grocery store, and we're like, oh, I could stand in line, or I could sit here and like crush some candy, right? And all these little moments, they get stolen, and it sort of feels like they go nowhere, but it turns into quite a lot, right? This is just Angry Birds, like, it's just Angry Birds. I'm thinking about doing Candy Crush, and if I did Candy Crush, it would just be insane, you know? So my dream reaction is that somebody comes in here and like laughs for a second and then slowly starts crying on the floor, right? It's meant to actually be like a quite dark piece in a way. And so again, like this connection, non-technical, but this connection to sort of an ethos that comes from the open source hacking community, this idea of play, and it's one that I'm looking back on my sort of fascination with graffiti and seeing that it was never the graffiti that I was really in love with. It was always this kind of notion of unintended use, right? Like this idea that we don't really think about in terms of, we think about graffiti, we think about wild style and Beat Street and this like 80s, 90s aesthetic, and we forget that at some point someone took this thing from the hardware store and did something with it that it wasn't intended to do, right? Like if you've ever seen old commercials of spray paint, it's like meant to like, oh, finish off painting your lawn chair furniture in 2 minutes, right? And someone was like, I have an idea, I'm gonna point that at someone else's lawn chair, right? And this was a really big mental leap. This was like a big hack. And it's one that I think is like relatively ingenious and is, for better or for worse, it's changed the way every city in the entire world looks, right? And so my association with graffiti is less about what those letters look like and more about where they are, what systems they're hacking into, right? What surrounds those letters. And street art is the same way. Like this is my favorite street art piece of all time. This is by an artist named William Lamson. And to me, this sums up everything about a hack in like one simple balloon that he dropped on the ground, right? It's playful, clever, anti-authoritarian, misuse, lazy, empowering, all with like a rock and a balloon. And so this is where I try to go with my work. And this idea of unintended use is like, I think of it like as a lens that you can look at everything around you, right? You can look at any technology and think, what is the unintended use, right? So you can look at things like robotic vacuum cleaners, and they're one kind of technology. And this is not a piece of mine. This is from an internet meme called Doombo, right? But how much more interesting is this than like a vacuum cleaner, right? Okay, I'll show one more. This one's a little bit crude, so I apologize, but this is also one of my favorites. I'll just play this one.
Уважительное отношение к политическому оппоненту, признание равноправия политиков, придерживаться различных взглядов, стремление к открытому диалогу.
So this to me is like a perfect activist intervention, right? And it's, I think back on this one a lot when I'm thinking about technology, because for me this is when technology gets interesting, right? It's like the Roomba became interesting not when it hit the market. It became interesting when it started showing up at garage sales, right? Like with the battery cover missing and like parts out of the control and like maybe had duct tape hanging off of it. Like this is when you stop like respecting it so much that it's on this pedestal, right? Like the case of all these computers that are in our pockets, right? They're not quite that interesting yet. Or like drones and toy helicopters. This is my favorite drone project ever, right? Like drones were so uninteresting until they got to the point where, okay, we can just wrap a dildo around it, you know? Like it becomes interesting when someone can swat it out of the air and we don't have to care about it, right? Like the technology gets interesting when we stop caring about it so much. And then the other piece of these projects that, and this is something that Eric Raymond said, talking about Linus Torvald, he said like, Linus's genius wasn't about writing code, it was about being lazy like a fox. Like he knew the quickest way between 2 points, and this was his true genius. And so this is like where I try to get back to in my work, like duct tape the knives, helicopter, dildo, done, you know? And so how that shows up in some of my own work, this is a performance piece called How to Keep Motherfuckers from Putting Their Seats Back. Very small intervention. Sort of sets up a game dynamic as well, where the two people in front of you, if they figure it out, they both have to go back at the same time. If one does it without the other, it won't work. So it's just a zip tie between two airplane seats in front of you. I leave this to you, it works. And so again, this is like trying to take that lazy like a fox mentality and work it into my everyday life, trying to take these places in my life that I find boring and turning them into studio time. Another example from that kind of art and airport series I did, this is one called TSA Communication, which is trying to think of these situations where I'm kind of unhappy and bored and have to go through very often for my practice. Think about something you want to communicate, put it in a backpack, send it through the X-ray machine, and it's this way of having this communication back and forth through this like mediated device, right? I'll admit this one is Photoshop. But the piece is real. It's hard to get that photo. They never let me take the photo for some reason. But it set up the situation that became part of my everyday travel experience, right? And it was really just this performance for me and the TSA workers, or in this case, the security workers in Bangkok. And it was meant to kind of be fun, right? Like the piece, my favorite reactions from this is when the security workers would start laughing, which was, I got that more often than I got body cavity searched, which never happened, I'm afraid. People always like want that to be the end of the story, but I'm afraid it's not. And so it really, for me, this is another piece in my own work I look back on and I think, okay, that was a piece that I made, and no matter what the kind of critical reception was or how it was shown up in the professional art world, just for me personally, this completely changed this part of my life that I didn't like, right? This act of taking a kind of A4 piece of metal and putting it into my backpack completely changed my airport experience, right? It was no longer bored, I can tell you that. Like, I was waking up, I was getting there very early, quite nervous, both about the going through with the metal play and documenting it, which is like another hard part. And so I turned this situation, which I used to be this passive participant, into this active one. And so this is another one where I try to get back to this point in other pieces that I'm making. Okay, new stuff. How much time do we have? Okay, we have plenty of time. So I wanted to talk about some new pieces. This is part of an ongoing series where I've kind of been talking about misusing non-digital systems, and I'm going to talk about misusing a digital system of the browser. For over a year and a half now, I've modified my Firefox settings to maximize my cache limit. Like 1 gigabyte is the maximum amount of cache your browser, Firefox, will allow you to keep, which is kind of an interesting thing. Like you're familiar with the cache directory on your computer, right? When you're browsing the internet, all these images, everybody knows this in here, right? And I'm in the right crowd to be talking about cache, right? So this is where your computer stores locally all these images. And it's this very specific place in a computer where by default, it's always overwriting. Like, you can't turn this off. Like, you can set it to a gigabyte, but that's the highest it can go. It's always going to be overwriting. There is no other way to save it besides manually going into that folder and pulling it out. And so I've been kind of harvesting my internet cache for a year and a half now in kind of 2-week to 4-week increments. And I have this pretty big data set full of internet cache, and I've been using that to make what I think of as portraits. So this is from an exhibition in Berlin. This is 1 month worth of browsing data. This is every JPEG, PNG, and GIF that went through my browser over the set period of time. And so I think of these kind of as these portrait pieces, right? For the show in Eindhoven, this FAT exhibition, I was dealing more with the kind of destruction side of this, because it's, on the one hand, you're archiving all this material, but on the other hand, it's quickly being erased, right? Like this is kind of, the cache archive is both something I want to hold on to for one reason and destroy for another, right? And so this is taking 42 meters of internet cache. This is a 4-month section of internet cache. And the organizers talked to the local grocery store, and we got to go back to where they kind of crush all the cardboard boxes at the grocery store and feed all this internet cache into this like cardboard compressor and turn it in basically like a physical cache clearing of 4 months of internet history. And so I've been doing this for myself for a while now, and I have a show coming up in just over a month, and a solo show in Stockholm, and it's going to be all about memory, and it's going to be thinking about kind of this human idea of memory versus this other idea of memory of like 256, 512, 1024, this other idea of memory that computers have, and how those two things kind of coexist. And so I asked a series of people if they would share their browsing, their cache with me, right? Which is actually a pretty like invasive question to ask, to say like, hey, could you go to this specific directory and send me these files? And so I reached out to various people. I tried to make this a kind of diverse in terms of age and gender and occupation and where people live. And a lot of people were willing to share this with me. And so I've been, I'm working on a series of prints now that are looking at other people over the same period of time. So these are all, these series of portraits are all from a 2-week period of time in March. So this is a gallery owner in Paris. This is a NASA worker in College Park, Maryland. This is a designer in Tokyo. This one's kind of awesome. This is from a professional gardener in Brooklyn. And it's like, it's plant porn. Like you can see it. Like the whole cache is just kind of like has this beautiful green kind of hue to it. It's laid out using algorithms called like sprite packing algorithms, if anybody's familiar with. It's like predefined algorithms where computers are trying to pack as many images into a small place, which are images that you commonly find in cache. And so these are what they kind of look like on a zoomed out level. And there'll be these prints, so you can kind of see them from a distance, but you can also come in close and you can see different experiences of cities, for example, right? So these are all pieces from, I believe she's a nursing student in North Carolina, where you can see a different view, all these little pieces that show up from Google Maps and how they kind of get mashed into this new kind of map that's more about her specific experience with both the physical world and with the internet. Other kind of things come up. This is from an artist who lives in Vienna, where if you might be able to figure it out based on the images. So it's just, this, like you get these interesting things where you have kind of figure skating costumes and like fried chicken, like these like interesting surfing patterns like start to come out, right? And so this is a new series I'm going to show. The other new piece I want to show, this is like something I'm just working on now, like I haven't even proofread this yet, is dealing with another kind of notion of memory and how computers have, there's like data storage, but then there's also this kind of like passive memory that happens in computers, and cache is one place, and the other place is like the drop-down bar when you can kind of see the last websites visited, right? And for Firefox users, all that data gets stored in this location on your computer, which you can find. It's stored in this MySQLite database, which is called places.sqlite. And you can find this and you can sift through this, and it'll show you like a scary amount of data of your browsing habits, right? Or maybe it's not scary, maybe it's just a really nice story, which is what I was thinking. And so this data is, I've kind of been collecting this data now, and I'm making a book. And as Mark said, this is like, I have a new daughter now. This is Octavia. And it's turning, so this data set's going to turn into this book called Since You Were Born. And if I switch quickly to the other screen, the book starts with the Google searches 5 hours before she was born. So this is the SQLite database sorted by date, and starting at 5 hours before her birth, right? And so this is There's no editing here. This is going to be a very honest account of her birth as viewed by the browser, right? And so it starts out, pregnant when to go to hospital, spelled wrong, right? This is my wife Googling, like, she's at home alone, I was out to dinner, and she was Googling, okay, pregnant when to go to hospital, spelled it wrong. Second one, pregnant when to go to hospital. Am in labor, when should I go to the hospital? So this is the data that shows up in the title bar of all this internet browsing history, right? I haven't divided this. That's actually going to be the preface to the book. The real book starts with, it really starts after her birth, which is what time is it in New York City? This is me in the hospital figuring out what time it is in the East Coast Standard Time that we can call home, right? And then, okay, recharge SFR, Google search. So my cell phone minutes ran out, so I can't call home, right? Then what time is it in LA? This is me calling my mom, right? Telling her about the birth. Squirrel mail, so then I'm checking email. Okay, then it gets strange. Then at some point, like, I just do some random internet searching. I'm in the hospital still, and I'm watching John Baldessari videos. This is a friend in New York. I'm checking Twitter, Instagram. Here's a Raphael Rosenthal piece I'm looking at. I don't know what I was thinking, but apparently I caught in a couple minutes of surfing there in between new baby elation. And it just goes on. This is like, I'm not going to go through the whole thing. It's like 150 pages, right? But it's another way of viewing, like, of course, it's very personal to me. Of course, it's all fascinating, all 140 pages. But it's meant to be also about kind of our own relationships with the internet, right? And so this is, like, I can go through here and I see all these things that I don't see when I'm looking through the photos. Like, this is me setting up OwnCloud on my server, trying to figure out how I can share photos without using, like, Flickr. I'll just take you through some more pieces. It ends up touching us here in this room in a moment. Here's me registering a domain name for her. Like, I'm looking up .ro. Like, can I get octavia.ro/th? Like, I'm trying to set up, like, her, like, URL. You know, it's a very important thing. She's just born. She needs a website. More photos. Then I get back to work. I'm, like, dealing with some work emails here. The highlights only exist for the point of the presentation. The highlights will not be in the book. But so this is, like, reminding me that this was, like, in the biggest heat wave that Paris had seen all summer, and the hospital had no air conditioning. So I see, we're reading about how hot it is here, and we're sitting there in these kind of like plastic chairs in the hospital just sweating. Then here's a series of searches, average length newborn. Like, we're comparing our child to the internet now. Like, okay, how are we doing here? Is it okay? I love that it's like, it's all spelled wrong. I'm sure it was me and not my wife, you know, like, trying to figure out, like, okay, what is this? And then it gets more personal. It's like, why is my breast so swollen and red? Breastfeeding football hold. You know, this is, like, real stuff. Like, we think of the internet as this place that's just, like, you know, lolcats and, like, BuzzFeed videos, but the internet is this real place that we all turn to, like, when things go really good and when things go really bad. And it also is, like, I like this point too. So here I'm, like, looking at the processing documentation for exactly how the random function works, and then the next one is, like, breastfeeding red marks, you know? So we get to these places in our lives that are, like, kind of strange. Let's see what else. Breastfeeding continuously, right? You can tell, like, how things are going in the hospital. This one was funny. So it's a Google search for how to let baby fall asleep on, is it okay to let the baby fall asleep on a nursing pillow, question mark, right? And then right after that, it's, like, back to surfing the internet. So this was me or my wife, like, saying, okay, is she okay on sleep on that pillow? And then the answer was apparently yes, because then I'm back to, like, checking Aram's Twitter. I'm back on Instagram. I'm looking at Raphael Rosenthal. I'm on Triangulation Blog. So now I'm getting some really good, like, internet surf time in. There's a few more in here. So it becomes this, like, okay, so here's an interesting one. So here, at some point, I'm Googling Mr. Mark over here. I got an email about some conference, and I was like, oh, who is this guy? Like, maybe I should take part in this conference. So I'm checking him out, and here I am. So what was happening in the hospital room in the internet is, like, affecting us here. I'm not sure if I was in the hospital at this point, actually. Here's me working on that bronze Katsu sculpture I was showing earlier. Here's me on Aram's Twitter account, because Aram was curating a show at that point that he talked about in his talk, where he was doing this offline art show. And I don't know what I think these were Twitter direct messages where he was probably saying, like, where's that piece you promised me? Show is opening. So then you can see what happens next is, like, the theme of the show is called hardcore, right? So he did this offline art hardcore show. So then you can see me starting to look through, like, thinking about this piece, what I'm going to make. So I'm just doing searches for, like, hardcore animated GIF. Somehow I got onto Street Fighter animated GIFs. All this is, like, Google image searching for, like, Street Fighter, Shoryuken, Flaming Shoryuken. This is like more Street Fighter research, flaming sure you can. So I'm going to show this piece. This is one that I did not send Aram. I made this piece, and my wife was like, no. And so I ended up making a different piece, but I still really like this one. So this is, let me see if I can pull this up really quick. So this is Shoryuken on powder blue. This is the piece I did not show in the exhibition. This is one that did not make the offline art show. It's pulling in, I copied this animated GIF hundreds of times and had the browser try to pull them all in. So as the browser's trying to load these things, the animation kind of gets out of sync with itself, because it's, so each load is like a unique view. But my wife was like, nah, it's too poppy, like make something else. So that turned into another piece, which I won't show actually. Aram knows what it is. I'll give you a hint of, well, no, I won't talk about that one. So anyway, these things happen, and like this representation of her, yeah, okay, you can kind of see where I was going. The theme was hardcore, so it kind of made sense to go into this. I'm trying to think if there's anything else in here I was going to show. Here's what living in France feels like without speaking French. This shows up a lot like this in here as you kind of quickly scroll through. This is like probably my wife trying to pay taxes. I forget if there's any other funny points in here. Google Translate. Constant Dull Art site shows up really nicely in here if anybody wants to. Here's me trying to buy onesies for my baby, like Thug Baby. I'm trying to find Wu-Tang onesies up here. Anyway, so this is this view of the internet, kind of through my eyes and through her eyes, right? So this is to me this book for this exhibition coming up, and it's as much about the internet as it is about her. And it's kind of, on the one hand, meant to be very personal, but then meant to bring up these issues that, okay, for me, this is like this really amazing document of her birth, but this is like, you know, touching on what Aram was talking about, this is things that more people know than just me, right? Like Google is reading this book right now on all of us, right? NSA maybe also. So it's also meant to be kind of sharing some really private data and seeing what that feels like to put out as a book, as an example of like what we're all doing right now in this room and every single time we touch the internet. Okay, so this is Since You Were Born. I'm going to show one last piece. I can see I'm 2 minutes over. The last piece I'm going to show, this is from just over a year ago. It's called Free Speech. This is getting back to thinking about hacking and misuse, again, more in public space. It's, again, like a very simple construct. It's just a van with a mobile telephone number, a loudspeaker, and the word free, right? And the way it works is I would just drive this around Vienna for the course of 3 days, and there's no instruction set, but if someone happened to call that number out of curiosity, their cell phone would be routed directly to the loudspeaker on the roof. And there was not even a voice on the other end, so it would ring, they'd hear silence, and they'd be like, hello, you know, and it'd be more like, hello, and they would have this voice echo throughout the city, and it's kind of, I think of it as the audio version of laser tag. It's like this other sort of uncurated free speech that's meant to be injected into public space, and it's in German. So I'll show just a minute of what this sounded like.
Fick dich! Fick dich!
Abonniert das auch schon Connection.
Hallo?
Hallo?
Nice! Geil! So fresh, Mann! Haut's rein! Tschüss!
And so the reason I like to sort of end with this piece is because to me this is really like the end game of hacking. Like to me, hacking, misuse, they're not end games, right? The end game is this like feeling of empowerment that I believe can come through this channel, especially in the arts. And so like this guy's reaction at the end, or the earlier one where you just hear this guy laughing, like the reason, like in my head, that you hear this kind of laughter is because you're witnessing someone experiencing what empowerment feels like, right? Like they're feeling that power kind of like pulsing through them. And so whether that happens with like a speaker, whether that happens through the browser or a fake TED sign or a zip tie in the airplane, like these are these notions of misuse that just these like tiny ways of viewing something from this other angle can put ourselves in a position where we have like potentially more power than we were ever meant to have. And so this in the end is like the work that really inspires me and that I'm trying to get across in my work. And so with that, I will leave you there. I'm going to be around having drinks, so if you want to have questions in Q&A, let's do it over alcohol. Thank you so much to Mark and everybody involved. Like, this was such an amazing time, amazing people. I look forward to speaking with you more over booze. Thank you.